Evening. I'm happy and honored to be your speaker this evening, and as we continue our study in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and finish that chapter up this evening, as was mentioned, I know we've just come off of an excellent gospel meeting with Doug Edwards, and there was a lot even in that gospel meeting that were thrown at us. There's been a bit of a gap here between when I spoke last and now, so hopefully there's not too much lost there. I don't want to spend a tremendous amount of time rehashing what we did last time because we've got a lot to cover in this as well, though I think it should go relatively quickly, but I don't want to spend half my time rehashing what we did last time. So we'll just touch on a few things and then kind of move on into it. As we start here in the second half of 1 Corinthians chapter 9, last time we ended sort of halfway through verse 12. The first part of our study, we talked about Paul defending his apostleship, which is going to be a continued sort of theme and core thing to kind of keep in mind as we go through, discussing his rights as an apostle, more specifically his right to be supported for his spiritual work. And he uses several examples in the first part of chapter 9, coming at it from a logical point of view, coming at it from a scriptural point of view, pointing out that the old law had provisions and principles in place for supporting those who did spiritual work and who dedicated their lives to spiritual work. And we'll see Paul continue that argument with even stronger points in sort of the verses to come. So as a quick outline here again, just kind of bring this up as a reminder and everything. We went through those first parts, and then here on the latter half, we're going to be talking about the principle of self-denial for the sake of the gospel, Paul's illustration of foregoing rights, and then the principle of self-denial for the sake of the gospel and encouraging self-discipline, and this example of running the race. So when we start in verse 12 here, he's going to be talking about foregoing rights, specifically emphasizing, and not to get ahead of myself or anything, but emphasizing the fact that it's not necessarily the important thing to Paul. It's not necessarily that he be granted these rights. He's simply making a point that these rights or liberties that he has and everything, and to be supported for doing scriptural work and dedicating his life to scriptural work, that it simply is something that is grounded not only in logic, but grounded in scripture. That's something that Christ himself even commanded to do, and so it's a right thing to do. However, for him personally, he's not going to participate in it, and he'll kind of go into why that is. And once again, this will harken back to what Alan taught in chapter 8, as far as the importance of understanding that you may have certain liberties. It's not always the most advantageous thing to participate or to exercise those liberties, given the circumstances. And so Paul is kind of using himself as an example to kind of back up some of those points that he made in chapter 8. So for a little bit of context, we'll roll back just a few verses, and we'll start reading from verse 8, but we'll only kind of make comments going from 12 onward, where we left off. So 1 Corinthians 9, verse 8 says, Do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for the oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much that we reap material things from you? So we're going to move on into verse 12, now that we sort of have the context of what he's speaking about here. If others share this right to claim on you, do not we even more? And we talked about this a little bit last time, but there's an implication there that it wasn't that the Corinthians were against supporting those who did spiritual work. They were against supporting Paul for spiritual work. Because again, this was about his rights as an apostle. This was a defense of his apostleship, because his apostleship was thrown into question and challenged by individuals. So this implication here is that they possibly did support other individuals, either presently or in the past. They just weren't supporting Paul. He says, nevertheless, we have not made use of this right. Notice he says we, he's speaking both of himself and Barnabas here. But we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. So even though Paul makes a strong point and case for his right to material support, he also reaffirms what he taught in the previous chapter, that he had the right, as we kind of mentioned, but denied ever pressing to make use of it. You might ask why that is, and that's a good question. And Paul will sort of get into this as we continue through the chapter. But he states here in the latter part of verse 12 that he would rather endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. He had the authority to exercise his right, but refused to do so that the gospel would not be hindered. Now, of course, the question that you might have, similar to the question that even I had, was why is that? How could that be? Wouldn't preaching full time be more beneficial? Wouldn't it save more souls in the long run? It's possible that that's the case. However, this was a new church. It was very quickly growing in number. More specifically, it was very quickly growing in Gentile number and in Gentile presence. Now, this is purely speculation on my own part, so just take this not as fact, but it's just pure my own speculation. But perhaps Paul thought that starting a church and then immediately exercising his right for support from that church would make his message seem more insincere. That he was in it for the money, that he was doing it for the money, as that was not necessarily an uncommon thing when it came to false teachers and those who ran other now outside of Christianity, other religious organizations, cults, things of that nature. So he didn't want to necessarily show that he was doing this for the money, rather than for genuine concern for their souls, right? If they made the choice to support them themselves, perhaps he would accept it, perhaps he would not. He could probably make an argument for both. He did accept from the Philippians, as we learned last time. As we go on through this chapter, there's going to be a lot of hints that he might have even denied it had they even offered it willingly to him anyway. Nevertheless, if it was truly more effective for him to press for support from them, I don't doubt that he would have. But if not, he was happy to work. He was happy to support himself as he had been. So the key here is that whether or not Paul was paid was not the point. It was not what he was trying to get across. It was not his concern. He goes on to say that those employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings. So the Levites were a people supported entirely by the other tribes. And even to back up Paul's point earlier, and toward the beginning of this chapter, when he talked about not only his right to support himself, but also his right to take on a believing wife, and therefore support for her as well. The Levites, like I said, were a people who were entirely supported by the other tribes. So all of them were, not just the priests. The priests and the temple workers themselves were also given provision, as he mentions here, for the bread and the animal sacrifices and things like that that were brought to the temple. But the entire tribe of the Levites were supported by the other tribes. Nevertheless, he makes it clear that supporting those for spiritual work is not only a good thing, but he mentions there at the bottom, he says, in the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. And it's an interesting point, because he's saying that this is not just a good thing. This is part of Christ's plan. This is something Christ himself commanded to do. In verse 14, excuse me, I already just read that. So just as provisions were made for the Israelites under the old law, provisions have been made for under the new covenant as well. Even during Christ's ministry, he expects and anticipates support for his servants. We're going to take a look at an example of that real quick. Well, maybe not. Thought I had that slide, but maybe I don't. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, I got ahead of myself. I was supposed to do this. I didn't have a marker on my notes here for this. So this is an example of what we were talking about earlier as far as the Levites given tithe in Israel for their inheritance. There's some additional verses there if you want to take a look at other commands in the Old Law for support for the Levites and for the priests and for the temple workers and the servants and everything to kind of back up that point. So in Luke chapter 10, verse 7, he says, and remain in the same house, eating and drinking. This is Christ speaking when he sends out the 72 into every town, just for context here. He says, and remain in the same house, eating and drinking what they provide, for the laborer deserves his wages. So he sent out the 72 to all these different towns to preach the gospel. That's their mission, that's their goal, that's their job. And he says the laborer deserves his wages, right? That they should be supported for going through and preaching in these towns. Paul goes to such lengths to make these points. I mean, obviously, Alan's gone through and given an excellent study and everything on chapter 7 and chapter 8 through multiple parts. I've got multiple parts here on chapter 9. There's a lot of content, right? Paul is really getting detailed and really making this point abundantly clear as he goes through here. And I think this is important, not necessarily for his own sake, right? Like, again, we're going to get into this and find out that he really doesn't care. It doesn't really matter to him whether or not he's paid. But he's doing this to make a point that this is an important principle that needs to be practiced. And so it's not necessarily for his own sake, but for the sake of others, for the sake of future spiritual leaders, for the sake of even ourselves in modern day. He's fine with denying himself, but he fights for the rights that others have. Let's move on very quickly here. 1 Corinthians 9, verses 15 and 16. But I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision. For I would rather die than to have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting. For necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. This is an interesting set of verses here. Paul is not asking for their support. He's making a point that having rights and liberties and exercising those rights, right? Remember, this is, again, not to just beat a dead horse here, but this is hot off the heels of chapter 8. So as I mentioned before, chapter 8 was about meat sacrifice to idols, and really he's making a principal point there about the liberties and everything else, and a right to either exercise or not exercise those for the sake of others, specifically for the sake of their souls. And as Alan kind of pointed out in his study on chapter 8 as well, all these scriptures are divided into chapters and verses and things for our sake, right? They're not that way originally. This is one singular letter. This is one singular thought that we're kind of going through in all these chapters that Paul has given. So this is one continuous thought from Paul, and he hasn't switched gears at all to any other subjects or any other points here. He's just expanding on what he previously taught in chapter 8. He's trying to convey here that there can be value in giving up one's rights or liberties if it means saving a soul. And in this case, he was giving up his rights to support for their sake. Paul then says that he's proud of the fact that he hasn't received any support, and clarifies that he isn't it isn't in preaching the gospel that he boasts, right? That's what he's saying here in the latter half, right? If I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting, for necessity is laid upon me. Preaching is a necessity and a responsibility that was charged to Paul by Christ himself. He can't boast in that for simply doing what he was commanded to do, for doing the job that he was given. Instead, what he's boasting about is the fact that he works hard to support himself so that he can, as Paul is going to describe here in the next set of verses, preach the gospel free of charge. Verse 17, it says, "For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, am I still entrusted with the stewardship? What then is my reward? I am still entrusted with the stewardship. What then is my reward? Then in my preaching, I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. So as we mentioned, this is sort of a point of personal pride for Paul. I don't think that this was something that he was, boasting publicly about or anything else. This was, and I think this is evidenced by the fact that as far as we know, and based on the context of what he has written here, he hasn't mentioned anything about it up to this point in the letter or any of his writings. He didn't want to be a burden, and he was letting him know that he's perfectly happy to not have without the support. Making clear to the church of Corinth that although he's making the principle abundantly clear to them, he isn't doing it as a way to ask for support himself. That isn't his motivation. He made the choice not to ask for support from his own, out of his own volition, and he's content with the reward being he's able to preach freely without burdening new Christians or a young church. He says, for if I do this of my own will, in verse 17 there, for if I do this of my own will, I have a reward, but if not of my own will, I am still entrusted with the stewardship. What Paul's saying there is that even if this wasn't what he wanted, okay, it wasn't his choice, right? He'd still have to suck it up and do it. He still had a job to do. He was still commanded by Christ to go out and preach and spread the gospel, especially to the Gentiles. That's what he talks about when he says entrusted with the stewardship. He's entrusted with the stewardship of preaching to the Gentiles and spreading the gospel. And in doing so, Paul is also setting an example for the church of Corinth of doing things willingly, okay, and consequently giving up things willingly for the sake of saving souls. In that, you can find reward not only intrinsically, but spiritually as well. Let's go ahead and move on. Time is moving. Verse 19, it says, for though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. So as we discussed earlier in the chapter, Paul supported himself through his own work. It's implied that he was a tent maker, but point being is he didn't depend on others for subsistence. Additionally, now he did, again, as we mentioned before, he did receive support that supported him for some time from the Philippians and everything, but he spent most of his time working through the weekdays and then spending the weekends in the temple preaching. Additionally, Paul was both an apostle and a Roman citizen. And we kind of touched on this a little bit during the Q&A last time. But in that sense, he sort of had more freedom than a lot of people, especially the Jews. He was kind of subject to no one except Christ. And in fact, some of the translations here insert the word men sort of at the end of there to kind of reiterate that point, right? As kind of a means of clarification that he's free from all men, not necessarily free from everything. He's not free from the law. He's not free from Christ or anything like that. Nevertheless, again, I think in the context of this particular set of scriptures, in the context of this letter as well, we've said it a million times. I'm going to say it a million more. This is Paul defending his apostleship, right? So he's making a point that he is not above anyone else, he is above everyone else except Christ, as far as the hierarchy goes, right? The rest of the Jews and the Gentile Christians, they were subject to the apostles, and the apostles were subject to Christ. And so he's explaining that hierarchy there, and again, reiterating the fact that he does have the authority as an apostle as well. Paul is going to introduce his next point using this juxtaposition that although he is free and not subject to anyone, he has chosen to make himself a servant to all others. Again, illustrating the willingness to give up freedom for the sake of winning, as Paul describes, souls. So if we continue on in verse 20, he says, to the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside of the law of the God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. So here Paul gives some examples in which he made himself a servant to win people over. He says, to the Jews, I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. Those under the law, I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. He understands and clarifies here, which I think is interesting too. He makes it very plain, like you can't get this wrong, okay? He's making it obvious and everything that he is free from the old law, right? The law of Moses, okay? But makes himself subject to it in front of those who practice it in order to win their respect. He knows there's no meaning to it, right? He isn't binding these things on anyone else, and he isn't participating in anything that might violate the law of Christ either. In the same way, he explains in chapter 8, verse 4, he says, therefore, as with the eating of food offered to idols, we know that an idol has no real existence, and that there is no God but one, right? He's saying that they're just stone carvings, right? There's no value to them whatsoever. So why make himself like someone under the old law in front of those that are? Obviously, as you might expect, this is naturally a way that you connect with people. It helps to lower people's walls. It helps to lower their barriers, so to speak. And if you can get someone to put aside their prejudices, their biases, their preconceived notions, they're naturally going to be more receptive to your ideas. So if you're trying to convert someone and you want them to listen with open ears and an open mind, you're going to want them to be able to drop their defense and be able to generally do so. Otherwise, it will be virtually impossible to reach anyone, and anything you say will be say or do will be in vain. In verse 21, he says, to those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. Once again, putting that clarifying statement in there to make it clear. So he's referring here, obviously, those outside the law. He's referring to Gentiles, right? He's referring to the Greeks. Again, clarifying that, yes, he is still under the law of Christ, and in the process of being one outside the law, he is not acting outside of the law of Christ. He isn't participating in anything sinful. He's not doing anything that would violate the law of Christ. The point is that, again, he does this to connect with people. And this particular example is important because as a Jew and a former Pharisee himself, to say that he would become, as a Gentile, would probably make some of the other Jews' heads explode a little bit. There was still a lot of contention between Jews and Gentiles at this time, even, unfortunately, within the church. This was something that, unfortunately, there was just a lot of, this was very much an overnight, so to speak, thing that happened as far as taking Jews and Gentiles, placing them on the same field, and saying that they're equal. And the Jews had a big problem with that. And it was very tough for them to get past it. It's why all throughout these letters that we see to the churches, especially as you go through Ephesians and Galatians, you see constant examples of the Jews binding old law practices on the Gentiles, saying they're not good enough unless they do these things as they continue to practice them. There was even instance, as we discussed here even recently, where Paul had to rebuke Peter because even he fell into the practice of kind of sectioning himself off from the Gentiles and everything else when he was in front of other Jews. This was still very much a heated sort of topic. So for someone who was, called the Pharisee of Pharisees, and with his background and with his knowledge of the old law, to say that he became like a Gentile to win the Gentiles was a radical statement, to say the least. This is one of the reasons too, as we go throughout the remaining chapters, and even the rest of the books of the New Testament, one of the most reoccurring themes that will come up is unity, right? It's what Jesus, we just learned here this last week in Doug's meeting, it's what Jesus prayed in the garden for. And it's something that the apostles will continue to reiterate through all of their letters and everything else. The importance and of unity could not be understated. As an example, let's see. Yeah, so let's take a look at an example in Acts 17. This is where we find Paul preaching in the synagogues. But he also spent time separately reasoning with the Greek philosophers. Won't go through this for the sake of time because it's quickly dwindling here. But I pointed out a few things here of what Paul specifically quotes here at the bottom, where he's talking to these philosophers. And he quotes specifically from some of their poets and writers. And I think this is important because this is sort of a perfect example of what Paul is talking about here in 1 Corinthians 9. This is him going to these Greek philosophers in order to preach to them, but he's approaching things from their, in essence, mental standpoint, right? He's coming at them not just with scripture immediately or anything else, but he's coming at them from quotes from their own people, right? Their own fellow brothers. And everything, and using that as a introduction or stepping stone to preaching the gospel. And this is a way to connect with people. This is a way to help people drop their barriers and perk up their ears and go, oh, this is interesting. There are other examples that you could point out too, where he goes in and says, oh, I see that you guys are very religious and that you have this idol, made to the unknown God. Well, let me tell you about what this unknown God is and everything. This is a way that Paul approached these things, right? He approached them from a very personable and approachable manner. He relates to his audience based on his audience, and he changes his tactics and approach based on those factors. And this is what Paul's referencing and talking about here to the Corinthians. And this is, I think, what it means when he's talking about becoming all things to all people. In verse 23, back up here a little bit, he says, I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them and its blessing. So again, he's reiterating his motivation here. This isn't for profit. This isn't for honor. This isn't for anything selfish. This is for purely to save souls. And as he explained previously in the chapter, that comes with its own intrinsic and spiritual rewards. Moving quickly, verse 24. Do you know that in a race that all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things, and they do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest I myself should be disqualified. There's a ton that could be said here, and we'll touch on a few things, but ultimately there have been countless lessons giving on this one set of scriptures. You can give multiple topical lessons on this set of scriptures, and so I don't want to spend a tremendous amount of time going over all this, but I want to give a little bit of context to what he's talking about here in this example, as opposed to just the principle alone, give you some historical context on what's being talked about here. So when Paul's talking about runners running for a prize, only one wins, and he doesn't box as one beating the air and things. He's not pulling random activities or sports out of the air, okay? He's making a reference here to the Isthmian Games. And this is named after the isthmus in Corinth. So this was a narrow land bridge that connected, in fact, I've got a picture of it here. This is the narrow land bridge that connected the mainland of Greece with the peninsula. And you kind of see it there in the corner, and it's very small, but that's kind of the position there. It is in kind of your modern Greece. So this was something that was very familiar to the Corinthians, right? This was their games that he's referring to. These were held the year before and the year after the Olympic Games. And unlike sort of our modern Olympic Games, where we hand out a gold and a silver and a bronze and everything to the first, second, and third place, there was only one winner in the Isthmian Games, and those winners were awarded a wreath, a little crown, made usually from Isthmian pine or what's called Nemea celery and everything, specific plants that they weave together. And so it was, obviously perished very quickly, but that was what the prize was, right? Because you got a crown and everything, and only the one winner was given the crown. And there were several types of events that were held. Specifically, there were several foot race events. There was also boxing that was held among some other different competitions. So Paul here is directly referencing something that the Corinthians were exceedingly familiar with. This was, of course, our closest comparison is the Olympic Games, which is still, of course, ongoing. But this wasn't just a race, right? This was a race that the best of the best competed in, right? So if we think about the Olympics and everything, it's very much the same thing. Only the best athletes from every country go and compete, and then only the best of the best of the best from that end up winning. This was very much sort of the same thing. This is sort of the ultimate race, so it's not just a race. Olympic athletes, of course, train diligently and push themselves to limits to improve. And as Paul says, in verse 25, it says, every athlete exercises self-control in all things. One of my previous lessons, I talked a bit about habits and habit formation and everything, and specifically about the book Atomic Habits by James Clear. And one of the things I mentioned there that is very applicable to this, not to reiterate any of those points, but the goal when it comes to doing something like running a race, okay, the goal is not to just run the race itself, or to run a marathon, or to complete a marathon. It's to become a runner, right? That it's a matter of adopting an identity, okay, and running, for lack of a better term, with that identity, and embracing it in such a way that you make that who you are, okay? So if you adopt that identity of a runner, you mold your behaviors to that identity. That's going to result in a much more effective habit formation. It's going to result in quicker progression. And so I think Paul's sort of saying a similar thing here, where he's encouraging the Corinthians to not just run a race, right? Rather, take on the identity of a professional athlete, okay, and run like you're going to win. There's only one winner, so you've got to put everything into it. You've got to run like you're going to win. Because our prize, okay, their prize was a wreath. Our prize is infinitely more valuable and imperishable, as he puts it. He says he's not running aimlessly, right? He's not inexperienced. He's not running like he doesn't know what he's doing. He's not throwing wild telegraph punches like he's never been in a fight before, right? In verse 27 there he says, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. Just as sort of a interesting, I guess, tidbit to kind of close us out here, when it came to these games and when it came to the Olympic Games as well, even back then, and obviously, modern day and everything else, we have qualifiers, right? We have competitions that narrow down to the best individuals and everything else from each country. Back then, it was really no different. In fact, this little tidbit here is taken from the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences in Arizona, and just a little tidbit about sort of the Olympics comparing then versus now. And they've mentioned there in this particular article, they said in the ancient games, athletes had to swear to Zeus that they had been training for a minimum of 10 months. And then they arrived in Elis, the city-state that hosted the Olympics, 1 month before the games, and had to train under the supervision of judges who would decide who was worthy of competition and who wasn't. So they had multiple things they had to go through to prove that they were not only the best, but then they had to go before judges and actually work for an entire month and train and show them that they were in fact the best and deserved to even participate the game or the sport that they're doing before they can even get qualified and everything to go. And then I guess again from there you only have one winner. So just kind of reiterating the point there of the importance and the I'm trying to say the level of what we need to achieve in our Christian life and what we need to strive for. Again, far more you could say on the subject, but we'll kind of reserve that for respective topical studies in the future for those that want to take those on. So I'll just leave that as concluding my comments for now, and we'll kind of open it up at this point for any comments or questions.
I might say this. I appreciate your remarks, but the Apostle Paul did everything he could to save others. He put them on their level all the way through. And there's a valuable lesson here for us today, too. We don't look down on others, especially those who are new Christians or those that come into our audience. We try to put ourselves in their shoes and identify with them. And the main purpose is to bring them to Christ, just like Paul was. He wanted to bring them to Christ. And so he humbled himself in cases, and he lists a whole group of things there that he did to be sure that he did everything he could to save others. So I did appreciate you.
Absolutely appreciate that very much.
I would like to make just a brief reference on two of the passages. Verse 14, where Paul says, even so the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. In verse 14, there's a great parallel passage as far as the message, not parallel to the event, but the message is found in Galatians, the 6th chapter, and verse 6. And this is the New King James Version. It says, let him who's taught in the word share the good things with those that he teaches. And basically it's the same message, that they should receive support from those that they work with and preach to. And this is what Paul is driving at. He did not only mention that in Corinthians, he mentioned the Galatians, and he mentioned on other occasions. It should be a common thread throughout the church, even today, that we respect those who give their life to preaching the gospel, that they would be receiving support for their efforts in their work. And also verse 27. I noticed that in verse 27, the New King James Version uses the word disqualified. But I discipline my body and keep it under control. That's not to preach to others. I must should be disqualified. In the regular King James, the 1611 King James, it mentions lest I should be a castaway. And the word castaway there means lest I become unfaithful. Mm-hmm. Which is the passage is really good to chalk in the memory bank for proving once saved, always saved is false.
Yeah.
Paul was saying, I've done all this work, but I realize at the end of the day, if I don't take care of the business, I could be disqualified or I could be unfaithful. So therefore, it is an easy passage to utilize, easy to understand, that I could be disqualified or I could be cast away unfaithful. I really appreciate the comments made, great comments along the way throughout this whole chapter. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Excellent point. I appreciate that very much. Anyone else? No? Well, I know that last time I mentioned to Bobby when he had asked about why Cephas was listed separately from the others back in the first part there, that I would research that. And while I didn't find anything concrete beyond what we sort of speculated, which is that Peter was the only one we know for sure that had took along a believing wife. So maybe there was some different positioning there on that. One thing that I did find just through general study on the topic is that Peter is mentioned separately from others on quite a number of occasions throughout the New Testament. There are a lot of instances where Peter is separated out from everyone else, and I don't necessarily have an answer for why that is, you could speculate on the fact that, Peter was obviously very, very important to Christ. He was one of the, along with James and John, he was one, that took him into the garden. He was very, very close to Christ as well. He was the first one that Christ appeared to before he appeared to others, the other disciples. But, there are multiple instances. In fact, one of the things that kind of perked me up too was even during Doug's lessons, and he quoted from Mark chapter 16, verse 7, where he says, go tell his disciples and Peter, that he was going to go before you into Galilee and everything else. And again, it's interesting how there's so many instances where they'll talk about the disciples and Peter, and he's always separated. He's one of the disciples as well, but it's interesting how they'll continue to kind of point that out and make mention of the fact that, again, even when Christ appeared, he appeared to Peter and then the 12. And he's listed separately on a lot of occasions throughout the New Testament, which I just think is interesting. So perhaps there was some sort of, it was a respectful thing or something because of his importance and sort of a prominence as an apostle and everything. Who knows? But just an interesting little tidbit there. So thank you so much for your attentiveness this evening. We certainly don't want to end without extending the invitation. If you are not a Christian, now is the opportunity. As we mentioned here this evening, this is such an important part of our lives, and we need to dedicate a lot of our energy and time and everything to train ourselves so that we might, as was mentioned, not become disqualified. So if you are not a Christian and need or want to heed the gospel, we know that you need to believe, you need to confess Jesus' name, repent, and be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins. If you are a Christian and you need the praise of the church for any reason, you can, of course, come forward as we stand and sing.